Hello and welcome to week 18 of this rainy season gardening video journal thing. We're gonna just skim over the fact that this week is about 7 days longer than it ought to have been. Various personal reasons though. It's been a dry week. There's been a couple of very light rainfalls, but generally speaking everything is drying out, everything's getting a little bit more flammable, and so most of this week is scything, but I've also started doing some planting in areas where I will be irrigating through the dry season. So yeah, so with that sort of covered, I guess we should get on with it. As I go around cutting the grass back for yet another attempt, I feel like I should be honest and say that I don't like lawns, which begs the question as to why I spend so much time cutting back grass into effectively a false lawn. And now over the rains this is an easy question to answer, because every bit you cut down is more carbon added to the soil, and during the rains more is going to grow up, and you're just basically convincing the grass to produce more mass, and you're shifting which species dominate, so the ones that are there in future are not going to compete as heavily with the ones that you want. There are arguments that you can make for cutting back the grass when it's dry as well, because every time you bring it closer to the ground it's more accessible to a lot of decomposers, which means that you're then boosting the populations of those, making sure your cycle of dragging this carbon, dragging all this nutrition under the soil where it's more accessible to your plants, is improved. You're also, by putting carbohydrates in the soil, and carbohydrates being, well, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, as those are broken down, you get your carbon content, some of it released as carbon dioxide, some of it converted into other life and fungus and more plants and so forth. But you also release water, which means you do a certain amount of irrigation. A sort of, pipeline irrigation, where you're just keeping the soil humid and adding a tiny bit of humidity to the soil without actually putting water directly on it. And that can keep various plants that are not too thirsty alive. And certainly late in the dry season, when there is absolutely no water, the humidity is generally low and the heat is very high, that is a good argument, because it is making the absolutely dry upper layers of the soil slightly more available, as well as shading the soil and cooling it down so that the deeper layers where there is moisture retained stay a bit moister. Things are more complicated over the early dry season, when we don't generally get rain very much, although you might be able to hear a thunderstorm trying to happen now just to remind me that we're not actually into winter yet, despite the recent dry spell. But over the early dry season we don't get rain, but we do get a lot of dew, and especially where there's standing grass, that can be an awful lot of moisture that comes down every day, just because the cold air moving through grass that is very often taller than me condenses out a lot of water. I mean, if you look at some of the bamboos well into sort of June, you will hear what sounds like rainfall within them, just because of the condensation on their stems and on the little hairs on their stems. So there is a value to the standing grass in winter, but the trouble is there's also a massive risk to it. With the main risk that standing grass poses being fire, obviously that isn't entirely negated by cutting it down. Grass lying on the ground is still going to dry out, still going to die, but we do have it closer to our termites, closer to all the decomposers who are going to take it apart. And by pruning the trees on top of that, as I'm doing to this mango tree, which is mostly a secateurs job because it gets pruned fairly regularly, all those little bits of woody material which take a little bit longer to dry out, a little bit longer to become flammable, will weigh down the grass and help it basically be held against where all the decomposers can access it, and hopefully have more of it sort of fed back into the soil or broken down to a point where it's not really flammable anymore before it gets too dry. And just beyond that, being able to see where a fire is creates a very different sort of management experience. So, if you have grass that you can't see more than sort of a metre in front of you, or 3 feet to be consistent with using Imperial earlier, it makes it very hard to know exactly where a fire is, and it also makes it very hard to put the fire out because, the fire is everywhere from the ground to 3 or 4 feet above your head. Whereas when the grass is at ground level, yes, it can spread quite fast. It won't usually spread as fast, and because you don't have oxygen all around the fire, it doesn't usually burn quite as hot. There are trees, obviously, which will match grass for this problem, but mostly those are plants like eucalyptus and pine, which we don't really have in Zambia. Most of our trees don't actually encourage fire. There is an idea that Miombo is a fire-dependent woodland. It's more of a fire-limited woodland, which I think I've said in a previous video. And with excessive burning, you end up with chipia, which is a very, very reduced woodland that mostly comprises of sort of the few things that have sufficient underground mass to keep coming up again and again and again after burning. Things like some of the wild gingers, and a lot of the acacias, which seed readily in really, really just noxious soils. But by replacing a lot of the tall grass with cut grass and trees, and trying to make as much of it rot as possible, it just means that there is a lot less risk of a massive fire just destroying everything, because even the trees here that can survive a fire will survive much better if a fire goes through at low level and not too hot than if it goes through on long grass and burning with incredible heat. I feel that at this point I should probably note that, as always, so far at least, no small dogs or chickens were harmed in the making of this video, despite, again, their best efforts. I'm also going to sort of talk about, and briefly, because I imagine everyone sort of grasps it already, why I would want to cut the grass with essentially sort of 16 inches of agricultural razor blade on the end of the stick rather than something more efficient like a tractor or or a mower. And part of that is just, if I'm cutting the grass with a hand tool, it means I'm moving more slowly, which means small vertebrates are moving out of the way. But another part is, if you are using heavy machinery, you are having a very different impact on the soil, and you can feel in places that have been scythed rather than tractored or mowed for the last few years, that the soil is just a lot more open, especially during the rains when it's much more alive and spongy, whereas even a small tractor moving through regularly is collapsing burrows, it's pushing the sort of spongy texture of the soil back together and recompacting it, which means that you've got a lot less water can sink into the soil, so a lot more is lost as runoff, which takes with it a lot of the nutrition of the topsoil. But you also have a lot less air in the soil, which makes it a lot harder for a lot of plants to grow to the sort of best ability. And in sand, especially very fine sand, like a lot of Zambia does have, compaction is very, very easy. It happens very readily. It's a lot harder to undo. So if you can reduce the weight that is moving back and forth on your soils, you can reduce that problem. Having complained, I guess, about having to cut the grass down, I feel like I should now say something in its favour, because I feel like I should probably point out that I am not a hobbit. I am, I would say, quite average in height, and this grass just dwarfs me. And that is a phenomenal amount of biomass that is generated every year at the moment, but by the rains, during the rains. And it is quite astonishing to me to think about how much carbon capture is wasted over this country every year when people burn grass back for various reasons. I can fully understand some of the small-scale farmers who are moving through areas using sort of Chitamene-type farming, that it's necessary for them to burn the area they're farming. But when you have cattle ranchers and, worse still, the national parks burning to just stop fires going through, so they'll do an early burn, which is usually done in winter when the dew will put out the fire by nightfall, and in these vast areas it's not always a very controlled fire. It can spread huge areas over the course of the day before it goes out, but it's still just a vast amount of carbon just fired back into space, and how much more of a dent could we put into Zambia and potentially even a wider carbon footprint if instead of setting fire to everything to stop it from burning, we could get it down to the ground. And I'm not saying that 19 million people need to pick up a scythe every year, but if we could change, and you do see sort of public attitudes towards it changing a lot recently, but if we could change the idea that burning is healthy, I feel like we could save an awful lot of trouble in the future. Not just directly from climate change, but just from environmental degradation and so forth. But that is a depressing little tangent that I don't think anyone enjoyed. I certainly didn't. I'm leaving it in though because I enjoyed Jennifer Lawrence screaming, "We're all gonna die," and "Don't look up," because it made me feel less alone. So maybe someone's gonna hear a depressing little tangent and feel like, or maybe they're not quite alone. Anyway. On a brighter note, scything is not the only thing I've been doing. It shouldn't have been the only thing, it just is time-consuming at the moment. To try and offset the Red Queen feeling of running on the spot, of just trying to keep things as they are, I do also have some seedlings to plant. These are not the youngest seedlings, despite being quite small. These have been maturing in my bedroom for up to a couple of years in some cases, but these are various fruit trees which will not be being planted in the order that you see them. They're actually alternating to make sure no species is next to the same species, except in cases like this where there's two custard apples in one pot and I didn't want to separate them because one of them looks like it might not last. Custard apples are quite nice and straightforward. Don't put them in too much sun. Make sure they get some water until they're established. And stop the chickens from eating them, because that's not going to go well for the custard apple or the chicken, because as per usual these are good and toxic. Evidently not toxic enough, because the last time I did a large planting of these and I didn't put stakes all around them, the chickens did destroy all of them. I don't know how many of them they actually ate and how many of them they just sat on to death, which is something our chickens quite like to do. But hopefully these little stakes will keep this one protected. Next up we have grapefruit, and there's actually going to be at least two varieties here. It's actually one of the things with citrus. People say, "Oh, don't germinate from seed, always get grafts," but that is missing out on the opportunity for all sorts of new varieties. And grapefruit should produce still grapefruit trees. It's still going to be a grapefruit. It's not necessarily going to be the same variety, but while these first two that are in the orange pots came from shop-bought grapefruit, the others came from our own grapefruit, which it's hard to tell what the varieties would be anyway because they're completely unirrigated, so they're not as juicy as they could be in their ideal situation. And for example, one of them definitely can produce ruby fruit, but it's only in very wet years. It does even have a pinkish tinge, just because it's basically under constant stress. So it's still going to be a grapefruit, and it's probably going to be better than its parent in that case. Interestingly, the shop-bought ones had 100% germination. I planted 2 seeds, got 2 seedlings. Our own ones had really low germination. I must have planted about 100 seeds. I'd taken that out from when I was making juice. And we got 2 seedlings again. But these will not be being spaced next to each other, so I'll be putting other trees in between them. I'm just planting them all in order so we can talk about grapefruits continuously. Now, grapefruits, of all the citrus, are ones that I'm most happy to put in shade. So grapefruits and Persian limes are ones that I know do quite well in shade. They really do suffer more from sun stress than something like a lemon or most oranges will. They also need a lot more irrigation if you're putting them in a lot of sunlight than something like a lemon would. I would say similar sort of irrigation to most oranges would prefer, but they will suffer more from the sun in my experience than most orange trees will. Oranges are quite happy in quite a lot of sun. I still would avoid full sun for any citrus in the tropics. And the reasons for that are kind of simple and complicated. The most simple explanation is within the tropics we have much more intense sunlight than you would have even if you had similar annual temperatures. Say for example in northern South Africa, we probably have a very similar climate to there in terms of our temperature. We have more rainfall than the far northeast of South Africa, but we have much more intense sunlight just because the sun has less atmosphere to go through to get to us at any time of year, which just means that things that are prone to burning are being exposed to much more UV. And whereas, humans can move out of the sun, plants really can't. So you have to be aware when plants are not well adapted to that level of sunlight. And as far as I know, there's not many truly tropical citrus other than things like the kaffir lime. But it is worth thinking about some of the more complicated reasons. So one of them is these are not a C4 plant. Now, C4 plants are basically plants that have an extra step in photosynthesis, which means that they are more temperature tolerant. And those are very suitable for sunlight if they have enough water, because they can carry on photosynthesizing when the heat of the day gets too much for normal photosynthesis to take place. If a plant is not a C4 plant, the middle of the day is just wasted daylight, so it's much better to have a lower light where it's photosynthesizing continuously, even if not as, excessively in the brighter periods, because otherwise it's just turned off for 3-4 hours a day. So next up are macadamias, and I actually don't know whether these are C4 plants, but I do know that they tend to be quite tender as seedlings. Now, part of that is, again, as with citrus, they often have very shallow roots. So for these ones, which I had originally thought only one of these seeds was good, and so I chucked the rest to the bottom of the pot and found out they actually do like being quite deeply buried. And I'm going to be carrying that on, so the root ball is going to start at least sort of 5 centimeters under the soil, or 2 inches for imperial measurements. And they are inclined to burn, so I'm putting these in a spot where they should be quite well shaded by a nearby bamboo clump from the afternoon sun, and they'll get some light shade from some nearby flamboyance for the morning sun. So they shouldn't get too hot, and also on the strip line it should be quite easy to keep them irrigated, because when they're young they can still be a bit tender. As with citrus in the true subtropics, so latitude-wise subtropical, they probably would do better in full sun again, although I would still be concerned about frost, because they can be frost tender, and even here I am concerned about frost, which is part of the reason that I've found that I like to find sheltered locations for them. They will actually start fruiting fairly young. Some people have said, I think, 3 years for some of the ones that friends of mine have got growing, although that is probably with significantly more attentive care than these ones will receive, with apologies. But usually you wouldn't expect much until 7 to 10 years. But I'm not really sort of concerned about commercial levels of production. We have some very, very successful macadamia farmers in Zambia, and I have no intention of competing with them. I just want the widest variety of foodstuffs being produced, and then all of them, as for example with this, along this drip line we've got 4 different types of fruit tree going in amongst turmeric and various other succulents, which should all provide mutual chemical protection, just because their defenses are so different to each other's, that we should find that everything gets along, and it's that thing. The more diverse ecosystems tend to be the most stable, because everything is protecting everything else from pathogens, and it just means that if one thing drops out, there's still something else doing a similar job. So as well as the macadamias, once I've finished staking this one in the hopes of it surviving our feathered friends, I have one rather sorry little loquat, which is from the year before last, and had been sat where rain dripped off the roof and took most of the soil out of its pot. Now, loquats are really, really sort of resilient trees. I do have some planted in full sun, well, more or less full sun, as close as I tend to get in areas that I could have squeezed another tree in. I've generally squeezed another tree in. And they're very tolerant of different soil types. They seem to do really well in soil that is completely dead and nothing else wants to grow in. But they do seem to do better with a bit of shelter. So it is worth bearing in mind that even though they can thrive in full sun, so if you've got a space that you want a tree in and nothing else wants to grow there apart from thorn trees, a loquat might be a good idea if you can water it a couple of times a year. But they do seem to fruit sooner in light shade than in full sun. Deep shade, they survive. Well, deep shade in the tropics, but so far they're not doing nearly so well as the ones in light shade in that situation. So that should be about it for now, I think. There should be another one next week, although I'm not sure there'll be one the next week after. Probably until October, it's going to be quite patchy. So I won't say see you next Tuesday, even though I haven't been very good at sticking to that anyway. There will be a few things on propagating succulents and probably more scything and planting of citrus and so forth along the drip lines where I can actually keep them watered. But otherwise, yeah, that's probably one more, and then you're more or less done for the rainy season one this year. So yeah, have a nice whatever season you're going into next.